Welcome back. This is lecture 5 of module 1. Lecture 5 is the last lecture of this module. In this module, we will will look at some other domains of research, other areas where language and society interaction have been language and society interaction in the sense of how one of them influences the other and what are the joint products of that interaction. All of these have been studied. Of course, again we will be able to talk about only a few domains, but some others we have added in the annexure. For the interested ones, you can look up. So, the domains that we will be able to look at are some ideas from the ancient world, where language and how language and thought were understood. Language and thought, because thought represents how the society and how human evolution also to an extent. So, language and thought in the ancient world. Social cognition as a discipline, as a domain of study, cultural neuroscience, linguistic relativity. These are the domains that we will be able to discuss in brief in this lecture. So, the ancient world automatically brings to our mind the Egyptians. So, we will start with the Egyptians. Many ancient societies and civilization placed utmost importance on language. So, Egyptians were no exception. Language has always been considered to be extremely important in terms of what is considered knowledge. So, today what we call thought, language, thought relationship used to be understood as language and knowledge relationship in the earlier times. Many societies, many cultures have looked at it from that perspective. How is language and knowledge connected? How are language and knowledge connected? So, in the ancient civilization of Egypt also, the idea was this was already there. So, language and speech in this culture. So, ancient Egypt, the story it goes like the firstborn son of sun god Ra is Thoth or Theot, whatever the pronunciation differs from one place to another. So, he was the god of speech. Now, the first, so the sun god Ra is a very powerful god, his son was the god of speech. Now, Ra's thoughts are hidden, nobody knows what he is thinking. So, his thoughts are expressed by thought, because only through speech he can bring out his father's thoughts. This means that through language only wisdom and knowledge could be made available. Now, these legends and stories or myths, whatever we call them, they are basically symbolic way of expressing the underlying wisdom in many of the ancient societies. So, Egyptians are no exception. So, the idea here that has been put forward by today's scholars is that this entire story of Ra and his son is because the way is to show that language is an integral part of knowledge. So, knowledge has no way to be expressed other than through language. Now, interestingly, the Thoth is also the god of knowledge. So, both god of speech and god of knowledge. That is something similar to India, because in in Hindu tradition also the goddess of knowledge is also the goddess of speech. So, Vagdevi, which is goddess Saraswati, is the goddess of knowledge as well as speech. Now, as a result of which, consequently, Indian intellectual traditions have historically regarded knowledge as stored in the mind and transferred from mind to mind through speech. That is why emphasis was more on the oral tradition over written script, because you can transfer. So, speech is the carrier of knowledge from one mind to another. So, this goes hand in hand. Bhartrihari, for example, one of the tallest scholars in this regard, Bhartrihari's Vakyapadya declared in this eternal identity of knowledge and word were to disappear. If this was to disappear, knowledge would itself cease to exist. So, knowledge will not remain knowledge if word is not there, if speech is not there. And in fact, he develops this idea in his theory of Shabda Advaita, where he proposes that Brahman is the ultimate reality. That is what it finally is, which has no beginning, no end. So, Brahman has the tattva, which is the nature of Shabda. So, that is where he creates the idea of Shabda Brahman. That is what. So, knowledge ultimately has to go through the sound, the word, the language, the speech. That is where he connects both of these. So, the central claim of Vakyapadya is that language, that is Shabda, is not just a tool for expressing reality, it is reality. It in itself it is reality. Reality belongs to the word, not to the meaning. Meaning often can be illusionary, like it can be Maya. So, hence the idea of Shabda is equal to Brahman. he rejects the idea that thoughts exist first and then words merely label them. Because here the later theorists in the Western tradition, there has been a debate on whether language merely labels knowledge or language constitutes knowledge. So, Bhartrhari actually precedes many of them in saying that the language constitutes knowledge, not it does not just give it a face or just give it a shape. So, thought arises through language. In early Western ideas, these are the two ancient civilizations that have theorized overtly on language and thought, Indic and the Greek. So, Indic we have already seen. So, the Greek tradition which precedes the Western tradition, their language was primarily scriptable or writing, and or also referred to as the written logos. So, language was primarily studied as a communication system. Written word was seen as real because it was visible. So, the scriptural code dates back to the Old Testament tradition, where God wrote the 10 commandments. So, all of these basically take us to the language as a communication rather than language as representing thought, language as thought itself. And their focus was of course slightly different: alphabet and writing, discourse and argumentation, rhetoric. In fact, there was a very important scholarly tradition of rhetorics in the Greek tradition. So, all of these mark the early Greek tradition. So, Greek theoretical tradition culminated in Aristotle, whose views on language appear in rhetoric and his discussion of the part of speech in Poetics. The Romans later picked up the study of language, prioritizing its public use and focusing on rhetoric, exemplified by figures like Cicero. So, the tradition continues from the Greek to the Roman, Greco-Roman, Cicero and others picked it up. And then there was a shift from viewing language as a writing to viewing language as speech. Many attribute it to the work of Saussure, which is known as the linguistic turn or the phonocentric revolution for West, which is attributed to Saussure's work, because he was a professor of Sanskrit, and so he conceptualized language differently from the prevailing Western viewpoint, and he brought in the concepts from the Indian. Many scholars say that he brought in some concepts from his knowledge of Sanskrit. So, there was a change, there was a shift in the focus, shift in viewing language as a writing to viewing it as speech. So, to sum up, Indian thought is characterized by non-fragmentation of jnana. Everything is interrelated. Philosophy, grammar and language inform all aspect of language. That has been a long standing tradition of the Indian intellectual history. But unlike early Western scholars who studied language as a communicative system, Indian scholars studied it as a cognitive system, because language and thought go hand in hand. So, this was how they looked at it rather than a communicative system. So, language not just represents reality, rather it created it through as you can see through the idea of the Shabda Brahman. In fact, the idea of language inseparable from knowledge and reality was also talked about Sapir and Whorf much later, few centuries later. So, we can in many ways we can say that these ideas were, some of it were present in the older traditions of Indic philosophy. Now, there is other domain of social psychology and social cognition in today's world, where language and thought and society and meaning all come together. So, when we talk about language and thought going together, we also mean language and meaning. What does it mean? So, thought represents the overall understanding, right. So, what is it that you mean by this, and that meaning is constructed via many kinds of social practices. So, that is where we are coming to now, social cognition. Social cognition is to understand, to cognize is to understand and act on that understanding. Social cognition talks about the cognitive processes or information processes done by the brain, namely perception, attention, memory, action planning and so on and so forth, and social cognition talks about doing all of that in the social domain. So, when we talk about the mental processes can be multiple. Just some of them I have mentioned here. So, perception, attention, memory, action, planning, all of these when they are understood, when they are analyzed by looking at that interaction with the social structure, social context and various other social parameters, that is when we talk about social cognition. That is in a simplified form, but broadly you get the idea. So, the goal of social cognition is to provide mechanistic process oriented explanations of complex social phenomenon. That is how it has been defined. So, some of the key scholars are these. Of course, there are many more, but we of course will not be able to go into detail of all of them, but these are some important names. Now, the idea, the primary point of departure in social cognition is talking about meaning, meaning as in meaning in human society. How is meaning generated? Meaning in language. So, how language as well as sometimes non-verbal actions also have meaning. Now, meaning is constituted. So, some have said that human society is saturated with meaning. Now, and this does not only mean when we talk. Even without overt language, simple bodily movements can carry meaning. A very famous example by Ryle, where he talks about when a school boy's right eyelid contracts rapidly, it might be involuntary twitch, a wink or even a mockery of somebody else's clumsy attempt at winking. So, this is what Ryle talked about way back in 1971. And depending on what is the meaning that has been understood by the observers, there will be different kinds of reaction to it. So, people would react to what they think he intended to do and not what he really meant. So, some people might think it is a twitch, some people might think it is a wink, some people might think it is a mockery, and depending on that, these are the reactions that people might have. So, the bottom line is when people engage with others, they do so by behaviors, but the others' meanings are critical to their social engagement. So, what I mean may not be the center stage, may not be the most important aspect of it. What others understood as what I meant is what is a part of what we call social cognition. So, how does meaning get created in society by people, what are the reasons, what are the interactions of various parameters, that is what we are talking about. So, a number of scholars have contributed to this, as we have just seen the list. So, the significance of meaning as a central force in cultural exchange in a society. So, early forebearers, Bartlett is one of the early forebearers, they were centrally concerned about this, and similarly later scholars also. So, the construction and communication of meaning lies at the heart of symbolic interactionalism of Bloomer as well as others, Mead also to an extent. Ostrom, for example, in his manifesto, The Sovereignty of Social Cognition, that is what one of his most well known work, argued that social cognition conceptualizes humans as interaction partners who interpret each other's behavior in a stream of social interaction. So, basically the idea is that society functions on the basis of social interaction among its members, and what is the primary thing in that interaction? The idea is that of meaning. So, what kind of meaning that you generate, what kind of meaning gets conveyed, understood, acted upon is what is the fundamental thing in social interaction. So, all of these go together. Brunner's call for cultural psychology is also a more recent advocacy for psychology that takes meaning seriously. So, language as well as non-linguistic meaning. Worst perspective again on the other hand, higher mental functioning, he talks about higher mental functioning is derived from social life and internalization of the capacity to engage in dialogue. So, how do you interact with other members of the society? This has a role to play in terms of your higher mental abilities and higher mental functioning. Hence, all cognition is essentially social cognition. That is how important social cognition has become today, because no amount of understanding, no amount of knowledge can be devoid of your social understanding. It cannot be outside of the society, because humans are ultimately social animals. So, cognition that is in some sense connected to the real or imagined presence of others. So, language is the symbolic system that makes this possible. In other words, when it comes to language use in society, we talk of mainly meaning in language and only derivatively of structure. So, the meaning is the point of departure, structure follows. So, language in its abstract sense is a socially shared tool allowing its users to create and exchange meaning. Meaning is created, you can see it all around yourself. You look at the gen, whatever gen is going on right now, there will be new words, so called words that will be suddenly popping up here and there. Over a period of time, they become kind of stabilized, they do have the one of the meanings that they get kind of standardized, and it gets part of the becomes part of the standard language. So, that is how meaning is created on the go all the time, and then this once that is exchanged throughout the society, it takes root. So, that is how it works. So, society and language and meaning generation go hand in hand. So, in doing so, the users of any particular language are connected to one another through this shared symbolic system. Ultimately, it has to be shared, otherwise language itself will not work, and social structure and social functioning also will not work. Levelt, another important name, William Levelt, was of the opinion that in particular instance of producing an utterance, a speaker engages in a number of cognitive and social systems at the same time. In fact, language processing studies show that even simple linguistic practices, linguistic processing takes into account a number of social and other non-linguistic factors. So, social and cognitive system constantly interact. So, put differently, from its inception, social cognition. So, we have started with Bartlett and now we are talking about Levelt. So, as a research tradition was meant to be scientific examination of the construction and exchange of meaning in social context. So, that is social cognition, where language plays an important role. So, highlighting the connection between language and social interaction and how they what is the interplay between them. Another domain which is more recent, this is of current recent origin, which is called cultural neuroscience. Now, neuroscience is not new, but cultural neuroscience is something new. This is basically a coming together of cultural psychology and cognitive neuroscience. Cultural psychology, of course, psychology from a cultural perspective, when you talk about how the human mind works, how the human mind thinks, what are the interrelation between culture specific properties and human mind, that is one domain. Cognitive neuroscience on the other hand looks at how the human brain works. So, and how the various kinds of neural structure give rise to various kind of cognitive processing. Now, this is an interdisciplinary. So, when they came together, when this new field came about, it has an interdisciplinary field. What does it do? It explores how culture, gene and the brain interact to shape our mind, behavior and even our biology. Remember, we talked about that the gene culture co-evolution. This is also something that cultural neuroscience looks at, that various kinds of behavioral patterns given the various cultural backgrounds and practices, it does affect our biology. So, investigating the bidirectional links where cultural values influences neural processes like attention, self-perception and so on, and conversely how our brain enables cultural capacities all across different time scales. So, key concepts are bidirectional influence, culture gene co-evolution and neuroplasticity. Cultural psychology emerged in the 1990s. Its main focus was cultural variability in social cognition. Human thought and behavior, including language, is as a variable as a function of culture. So, it combined psychology and linguistics to study language as a lived, culturally embedded cognitive process. So, linguistics and language is not something that is devoid of connection with everything else. It is one factor that takes into account multiple other variables. So, that is how it basically it is a cognitive process. So, that is what cultural psychology also looks at. So, the cultural difference was taken as a reason of having important impact on thought itself and more importantly on group thought. So, it shows how language influences perception, reasoning, categorization within specific cultural settings, that is cultural psychology. On the other hand, cognitive neuroscience, if you break it down a little bit more, what does it do? This field studies the human brain and its function. The use of various kinds of brain imaging tools, fMRI, EEG, whether it is hemodynamic method or it is electrophysiological method, various tools are used in this domain to look at how the brain does what it does. What are the mental functions? So, the neural signature of mental functions, cognitive functions, that is what these tools look at. So, when you integrate them, cultural neuroscience by combining these two domains provides insights of how language influences the brain, culture influences the brain both, and conversely the role that the brain may play in building and maintaining culture, both it works both ways, it is bidirectional. So, it integrates because the majority of the tools that cultural neuroscience uses comes from neuroscience, and because we are looking at how the brain functions, because it is primarily neuroscience. So, how the neural signatures of various kinds of cognitive mechanism that interacts with cultural practices. So, tools are primarily from neuroscience. So, one of the most interesting thing in this is that the behavior may sometimes appear the same across culture, but differ in neural representation in each culture. Now, the role of language in cultural neuroscience, because language is very intimately related to culture. This is one major areas of study, major area of research within the broader cultural neuroscience domain. The languages often work as markers and dividers of who they are as groups. So, language creates identity, that we already know. Hence, variation in language correlates strongly with variation in culture, that is also well known. Now, this is what we also look at using neuroscience techniques. So, when there are groups who are bound by one language and one culture versus when they are not, and then sometimes some very interesting results have also come out from this. So, this dialectal variation, for example, important variation of the same language, dialects often mark cultural difference. So, German speakers in Germany versus in Switzerland, they will have cultural differences. So, even when you share the language, you may or may not share the culture. On the other hand, exceptions also exist. Exceptions like all English speakers as so English is spoken as L1 across many countries, but they have different cultures, and this has bidirectional influence, and this is also seen through using neuroscientific techniques. Some other domains, for example, in the domain of written language and spoken language, and their activation pattern in the brain have been studied in this regard. Very interesting result, for example, the script, the way a language is written has leads to different ways of processing it in the human brain. So, for example, languages like Chinese, which are they began as pictures. So, these are called ideographic languages. So, these are based on symbols, which historically was some sort of pictures. On the other hand, phonographic languages like English is based on symbols representing sounds. So, there is a primary difference between these languages. Now, as a result of which they are processed differently in the human brain. So, for Chinese readers, there is a particular area in the brain called visual word form area. In Chinese, when somebody is processing Chinese language, that particular area has been found to be more active as opposed to the Western readers. So, the English speakers, let us say. This difference is attributed to solely to the difference in script. Similarly, spoken language and brain activation difference are also there. So, in case of bilingual language processing, one's age of acquisition, this is written in short like this: AOA, degree of proficiency, amount of language exposure, all of these are important variables, and they have different kinds, distinct kinds of brain activation pattern. So, apart from the differences, there are some universality in speech processing as well. For example, similar brain areas become active when hearing phrases in one's native language versus a new or unfamiliar language. So, all these things that we know because we look at cross cultural, cross linguistic patterns of brain behavior using the tools of neuroscience. Now, this interplay between culture and language in terms of neural signature extend beyond script and speech, other domains, other abstract domains like for example, the notions of time, mathematics, music, these have also been studied. All of these are also cultural artifacts. Music is certainly a culturally specified kind of a abstract notion. So, time again. So, for example, for English speakers consider time moving horizontally, Chinese speakers think the time moves vertically. Now, this subsequently affects, this is where we are talking about cross cultural differences in the neural signature of processing abstract notions like time. So, subsequently affects how the speakers of these languages think chronologically. Now, interestingly, bilinguals' concept of time can depend on the age at which they acquired their second language. So, not only the language that you speak and the way that language conceptualizes time, but there is also an interplay of in the bilingual mind depending on at what time, at what age they learnt, what is the proficiency and so on and so forth. So, multiple things can actually interact with each other. Now, this demonstrates that language powerfully shapes thoughts about abstract concepts, but remains malleable. Mathematics is another domain that has been studied. Abstract concept again, this is also shaped by culture and language. So, behavioral differences across cultures have been found in this domain. Asians tend to outperform Westerners in mathematics, while showing pronounced differences in neural activation. For example, while solving a mathematical problem, English speakers show activation in the language areas, while the Chinese show activation in the visuospatial network. So, mathematics is considered to be neutral, it is not culture specific, it is not language specific, but even then we see that when the Asians versus Westerners, when they are doing mathematics, they are solving mathematical problems, different brain regions are activated. Now, this has to be connected to various other things, all of which will be part of the cultural psychological part. So, this is how cultural neuroscience also studies. Mathematics may simply be easier to process for speakers whose written languages are visuospatial like Chinese. Is that the reason why Chinese people outsmart Westerners in mathematics? May or may not be, as mathematical performance is highly related to visuospatial working memory. This has also been studied. I have added the references, very interesting research coming out, the data coming out. And then comes the domain of music. Music is also considered universal language in the sense that similar music invokes similar emotions and so on. However, here too culture specific peculiarities are visible. Pitch and tone are two important variables that have been studied a lot. For example, perceivers ERP signals for expectancy violations, that is deviation from a melody's expected pattern as well as melody congruence, shows their own culture advantage. So, there are these features that have been looked at. A possible explanation for this may be that rhythmic grouping in music tend to correspond to cultures and languages accent patterns. So, Chinese again the tonal language speakers have an upper hand in case of music performance, music cognization and so on and so forth. So, many studies are also taking place in this domain currently. Time perception, bilingual flexibility. So, time perception we already talked about it. Bilingual flexibility, bilinguals concept of time can depend on the age at which they learn. And there is another very connected, well connected idea within this broader domain is the idea of linguistic relativity. Now, this idea has come from the linguistic side. So, the where language, the relativity, the language structure affecting the way you look at the world, that is what linguistic relativity is all about. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, there are the stronger and the weaker version, but broadly the idea is that language structure influences the person's, the speaker's worldview. So, the way the language structures reality is how you look at it. So, if the Eskimos have 17 different words for snow, the Eskimos can find out better, they know better about snows than the English speakers, who has only two words, snow and ice. That is what Sapir-Whorf hypothesis in the initial stages were. That is the strong hypothesis. Eventually, of course, because of lack of empirical support, because of lack of data, in modern times we do not anymore support the strong hypothesis, but it suggests that linguistic categories have an influence. It may not limit, may not determine, but it does have an influence on the way we cognize. So, on the way our thought and perception works, there is at least some amount of influence, if not a completely determining or limiting influence, but influence there is. In fact, there is also another important theory in this domain called thinking for speaking, but that is for another domain. This is not part of this, this is not no, you do not have time to discuss all of that, but the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is also one domain from linguistic side which talks about language and culture interrelationship. And today's cultural neuroscience does give us some proof that culture specific ways of doing things, language, be it language, music or mathematics, there is some amount of difference in the neural signature that we can find using modern techniques. So, these are some domains all of which are connected to language, culture, language society, cross cultural, cross linguistic understanding of various things, various forms, various parameters in the world. All of these have been studied by all different kinds of theoretical and as well as disciplinary dispositions. So, this hopefully gives you a broad idea that language society interaction is not something that is very unique. It has been studied, but in this course we will be sticking to primarily the linguistic and the anthropological and the ethno-linguistic perspective. But this first module was designed in such a way that you understand that even beyond linguistics, beyond anthropology and beyond ethnographic understandings, there are domains which are also interested. So, that is where we complete this lecture, and with this we also complete this module. So, this is where module end completes. Thank you.